August 1945. In London, church bells ring for victory. Crowds fill Trafalgar Square. The Union Jack flies over a quarter of the Earth's landmass and 700 million people. Britain has won the largest war in human history. And Britain is broke. Turn from the celebrations to the ledgers in Whitehall, and the numbers tell a different story. The war has cost Britain roughly a quarter of its entire national wealth, £7 billion in liquidated assets, overseas investments sold to keep the guns firing. The country owes £3.5 billion abroad, most of it to its own empire. India, Egypt, the sterling area holding IOUs the Treasury cannot honor. External debt has multiplied more than sevenfold since 1939. The reserves that once made London the arbiter of world money are gone. Gold and dollar holdings have fallen so far that officials calculate the nation can finance perhaps a few weeks of imports. Exports have collapsed to a third of pre-war levels. The factories that should earn the country's keep spent 6 years building tanks and Spitfires, not goods to sell. On August 21st, 6 days after Japan surrenders, Washington abruptly cancels Lend-Lease, the American supply line that had kept Britain fed and armed. The subsidy stops without warning. One economist calls the moment a financial Dunkirk. John Maynard Keynes, the government's chief economic negotiator, warns the cabinet bluntly. Without fresh American credit, Britain faces ruin. Here is the paradox at the center of this story. The empire that had policed the oceans, printed the world's reserve currency, and lent money to kings and republics for a century, could no longer afford itself. It had spent its treasure to defeat Hitler and, in doing so, spent the very thing that made it a great power: money. Victory and bankruptcy had arrived in the same telegram. How does the richest empire the world has ever seen end up unable to pay its own bills? To understand the fall, you have to see the height. 30 years earlier, Britain had not borrowed from the world. The world had borrowed from Britain. Rewind to 1913. The center of the financial universe is a single square mile on the north bank of the Thames, the City of London. From its counting houses and merchant banks, capital flows outward to every continent. Britain has invested some £4 billion overseas, roughly 40% of the entire world's foreign investment. Argentine railways, American factories, Indian tea, South African gold, much of it runs on British money. In 1913, Britain is the largest creditor the world has ever known, and the pound is the closest thing the planet has to a universal currency. This is the meaning of the phrase, banker to the world. Britain does not merely trade, it lends. The interest and dividends flowing back, the return on a century of accumulated capital, earn the country around £200 million a year, a river of income that requires no factory and no ship. The empire is funded, in large part, by the labor of others repaying British loans. At the heart of the system stands the pound sterling. Since 1821, the pound has been fixed to gold, £3, 17 shillings, 10.5 pence to the ounce, and the promise has never been broken. A pound note can be exchanged for gold on demand at the Bank of England. That reliability makes sterling the world's reserve currency, the money in which nations settle their debts, price their commodities, and hold their savings. Roughly 60% of global trade is financed in sterling. To hold pounds is to hold something as good as gold. Better, because gold earns no interest, and sterling does. The Bank of England governs this order with astonishing economy. Its gold reserve is tiny, often under £40 million, yet it commands the whole system because the world's confidence does the heavy lifting. A small movement in the bank's interest rate can pull gold toward London from Berlin, Paris, or New York. It is an empire of trust as much as territory. And trust, unlike a fleet, cannot be rebuilt once it breaks. In August 1914, the guns of a new war would begin, quietly, to break it. For a decade after the war, one idea haunts the men who run British money. Restore the pound. Return sterling to gold at its old, majestic pre-war value, $4.86 to the pound. and the world will trust London again as it did before 1914. The task falls in 1925 to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Winston Churchill. He is not a financier, and he hesitates. His own economic advisor is uneasy. The economist John Maynard Keynes is openly appalled. But the bankers of the city and the Bank of England's governor, Montague Norman, insist that prestige demands it. On the 28th of April 1925, Churchill announces that Britain will return to the gold standard at the full pre-war parity. The decision is a disaster, dressed as a triumph. To hold the pound at $4.86, British goods must be priced as if the war and its inflation never happened, leaving exports overvalued by perhaps 10%. Coal, steel, cotton, ships, all suddenly too dear for foreign buyers. Orders dry up. To defend the currency, interest rates stay high, and wages must be forced down. Keynes fires back with a pamphlet whose title says everything: The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill. The bill lands first on the coal fields. Mine owners demand longer hours and lower pay, and in 1926, the miners' resistance detonates the general strike, 9 days in May when the whole country stops. The strike breaks, but the misery does not. Through the late 1920s, British industry limps while America roars. Then the roar ends. In October 1929, Wall Street crashes, and the shock races across the wires to every capital. Credit freezes. Trade collapses. The tangle of war debts and German reparations that had propped up the 1920s comes apart. In 1931, the pressure becomes unbearable, and Britain is driven off the gold standard it had suffered so much to rejoin, sterling falling free at last. The golden chain is struck off, but the empire it was meant to glorify is poorer and shakier than before. And out beyond the ledgers, in Germany, a new and hungrier danger is already rising, one that will demand of Britain a price beyond money. By the summer of 1940, the reckoning has arrived. France has fallen. The British Army has scrambled home from the beaches of Dunkirk, leaving its guns behind. Britain stands alone against Nazi Germany, and it stands very nearly broke. Modern war is bought, not merely fought, and once again the arsenal is American. But this time a wall of law stands in the way. America's Neutrality Acts forbid selling arms on credit to nations at war. Roosevelt's compromise is a rule with a hard edge: cash and carry. Britain may buy American weapons, but it must pay cash in dollars or gold up front and carry them away in its own ships. No loans, no credit, cash. So Britain empties its pockets onto the table. Gold is loaded onto warships and sent across the Atlantic. At one point, the cruiser HMS Emerald carries a fortune in bullion to Canada, part of a secret operation to move the nation's reserves to safety and to spend them on survival. And when the gold runs low, Britain must sell its businesses. The Treasury forces the sale of British-owned American companies, the last of the old imperial portfolio. The prize case is American Viscose, the profitable U.S. arm of Courtaulds, a company worth more than $100 million, seized and sold off in a hurried wartime auction for perhaps $54 million, a fraction of its worth. An asset built over decades, dumped in weeks to buy another month of rifles. Winston Churchill, now Prime Minister, watches the reserves drain towards zero. By the end of 1940, Britain's dollars and gold are almost gone, down to the last few $100 million and falling. The country can keep fighting, or it can keep paying, but the arithmetic says it can no longer do both. In December, Churchill writes a long, frank letter to Roosevelt, laying the crisis bare. Britain will soon be unable to pay for the ships and planes it needs to survive. The cash has run out. What comes next will keep Britain in the war, but it will quietly name the price of the empire itself. Roosevelt's answer arrives in the spring of 1941, and he sells it to Americans with a homely picture. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you lend him your garden hose. You do not haggle over the price while the flames spread. The Lend-Lease Act, signed on the 11th of March 1941, lets the United States hand Britain the weapons of war, ships, aircraft, tanks, food, without cash up front. Over the war, more than $30 billion of aid will flow to Britain this way. It is, Churchill later calls it, the most unsorted act in the history of any nation. But read the fine print. Lend-Lease is not a gift, it is aid on terms, and the terms are written in Washington. The master agreement that governs it contains a clause, Article 7, that looks harmless and is not. In return for the aid, Britain must commit to work toward the elimination of discriminatory trade practices after the war. And there is one great system of discrimination the Americans have in mind, imperial preference. Imperial preference is the economic skeleton of the British Empire, the web of tariffs agreed at Ottawa in 1932 that lets Canada, Australia, India, and the colonies trade with Britain on favorable terms and shut American goods out. It is the wall around the imperial market. And Article 7 quietly asks Britain to promise to pull that wall down. American officials, chief among them Secretary of State Cordell Hull, are true believers in open trade, and they see in Britain's desperation the chance to dismantle a closed empire that had locked their exporters out for a generation. The men negotiating for Britain understand exactly what is being asked. Keynes fights the wording line by line, warning that it mortgages the empire's economic future. But a drowning nation does not choose its rope. Britain signs. America saves the war effort. There is no doubt of it, and no British survival without it. But the same hand that passes the hose is writing the terms that will unmake the economic empire behind it. The debt is buying victory, and clause by clause, spending the empire to pay for it. August 1945. 2 atomic bombs end the Pacific War, and on August 21st, with barely a week's warning, President Truman signs the order that stops Lend-Lease dead. The pipeline of American guns, ships, and food that had kept Britain fighting simply switches off. Overnight, a nation that had spent 6 years and a quarter of its national wealth destroying fascism discovers it is broke. Reserves stand near empty. Exports have collapsed to a third of 1938 levels. Britain owes £3.4 billion across the sterling area to India, Egypt, and a dozen others who park their war credits in London. The Treasury calculates a deficit so vast that officials speak, without irony, of a financial Dunkirk. The costs of victory had come due, and there was no money to meet them. Into this ruin steps John Maynard Keynes, the most celebrated economist alive, 62 and ailing, his heart failing. He sails to Washington in September, expecting gratitude for a shared victory, perhaps a gift or an interest-free grant of $6 billion. He finds instead a negotiating table run by men who see a supplicant, not a partner. For 3 months, Keynes argues across the green bays of the U.S. Treasury, his brilliance blunted by a simple fact. Britain has nothing left to bargain with. America holds the cash, and cash is the only currency that speaks. The deal that emerges in December 1945 is not a gift. It is a loan of $3.75 billion at 2% interest, repayable over 50 years, the final installment due in 2001. And chained to it is a condition that will prove fatal. Within 1 year, sterling must become freely convertible into dollars. Any nation holding pounds may demand gold or greenbacks on request. Keynes returns home gaunt and defeated, having won the money and lost the terms. The House of Commons ratifies it grudgingly, some members weeping, others calling it surrender. Keynes himself is dead within 4 months. The loan buys time, but the clause is a trap with a fuse already lit, set to detonate on a single date in the summer of 1947. The fuse burned for 18 months. On July 15, 1947, Britain honored the American clause and made the pound sterling freely convertible. Any holder of pounds anywhere on earth could now walk into a bank and demand dollars in exchange. For a currency the world no longer trusted, it was an open invitation to flee. They fled at once. Governments and traders across the sterling area, Egypt, India, the Gulf, South America, had spent 2 years hoarding pounds they could not spend. Now they cashed them for dollars, the only money that could buy American machinery, wheat, and oil. The drain was ferocious. In the first week, Britain lost $106 million. By August, it was hemorrhaging $237 million a week, then more. The $3.75 billion loan, meant to last year's, was pouring out of the Bank of England's vaults in a matter of days. On August 20th, 1947, just 37 days after it began, the government suspended convertibility. The experiment America had demanded had lasted barely 5 weeks and swallowed most of the loan. It was a national humiliation dressed as a technical adjustment. Sterling was no longer a currency the world wanted to hold. It was one the world wanted to be rid of. The reckoning was only postponed. For 2 more years, Britain defended the pound's official value of $4.03, a rate inherited from the age when London ruled world finance. But the arithmetic was merciless. Exports too weak, dollars too scarce, debts too large. In September 1949, the Attlee government surrendered to the numbers and devalued sterling in a single stroke, from $4.03 to $2.80, a cut of more than 30%. 30 other countries devalued with it, dragged down in sterling's wake. The pound that had been the fixed star of global commerce for a century was now a managed, shrinking thing, propped up by American goodwill. The world had found its new anchor, and it was not sterling, yet Britain still believed it was a great power, until 7 years later, a canal in Egypt would prove otherwise. July 15, 1947. As required by the American loan, Britain made the pound freely convertible into dollars. The theory was elegant. The reality was a stampede. Around the world, everyone holding sterling, governments, exporters, central banks from Cairo to Buenos Aires, rushed to convert their pounds into dollars before the window closed or the reserves ran dry. It was a bank run on an entire currency, and Britain was the bank. The numbers moved with terrifying speed. In the weeks after convertibility, dollars drained from London's reserves at a rate approaching $200 million a week. The $3.75 billion loan meant to last year's was hemorrhaging away in a single summer. By early August, the reserves were vanishing faster than the Treasury could count them. Clement Attlee's government watched a year's cushion evaporate in 5 weeks. On August 20th, 1947, just 36 days after it began, Britain suspended convertibility. It was a naked breach of the agreement Keynes had died defending, and Washington, seeing the wreckage, did not object. The experiment was over. The damage was permanent. Nearly $1 billion of the American loan had been spent buying nothing but the discovery that sterling could not stand on its own. The lesson landed like a verdict. The pound was no longer a world currency backed by an empire's confidence. It survived now only inside the ring fence of the sterling area, propped up by exchange controls, ration dollars, and the sufferance of Washington. Meanwhile, a new architecture had risen at Bretton Woods in 1944, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and at the center of it all, a single anchor currency, the United States dollar, convertible to gold at $35 an ounce. The world's money now flowed through New York, not the city of London. Britain still flew its flag over a quarter of the globe, still governed India for a few more weeks, still called itself a great power. But it governed its own currency only at America's pleasure, $1 crisis away from collapse. The empire could still fight a war. What it could no longer do was afford to lose a single run on the pound. That truth would be tested, finally, fatally, over a canal in Egypt 9 years later. The decision had, in truth, been made a decade before the guns of Suez fell silent. In July 1944, while the war still raged, 730 delegates from 44 nations gathered at a resort hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design the financial order that would follow victory. Keynes was there, arguing for a neutral world currency he called the Bancor. He lost. The Americans, holding 2/3 of the world's gold, wrote the rules their strength allowed. The system that emerged, made the US dollar the center of everything. The dollar alone was fixed to gold, at $35 an ounce. Every other currency was fixed to the dollar. To trade, to save, to settle debts, the world would now hold dollars in its vaults, not pounds in London. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank rose in Washington, not the city. In a single stroke of the pen, the currency of empire was retired, and the currency of a republic crowned in its place. It was a quiet coronation. No territory changed hands. No fleet was sunk. Sterling, which had financed the railways of Argentina and the docks of Bombay, which had been as good as gold for 100 years, became a regional currency managed from crisis to crisis. By the 1970s, the sterling area dissolved, and the pound floated free. Smaller, humbler, national, Britain had not been conquered. It won the First World War and the Second, stood alone against Hitler, and never saw an enemy soldier march through London. Its armies were victorious on every decisive field. And yet the empire was gone within a generation of its greatest triumph. Its colonies independent, its navy shrunk, its word no longer law in the world's markets. The reason was written in the ledger, not on the battlefields. Every victory had been bought on credit, and the creditor now set the terms. Britain had spent its empire to win its wars, and handed the century to the nation that held the notes. That is the whole of the story. Debt, not defeat, ended the empire.